Nearly 200 years, almost every time scientists looked closely at indigenous history in North America, they found a reason to doubt that native people built what they built, or belonged where they'd always said they belonged. Giant earthworks in the Mississippi Valley? Must have been a lost white race. A skeleton found on a riverbank in Washington state? Must have been European or Polynesian. A rare genetic marker in a handful of northeastern tribes. Must be proof of some secret transatlantic crossing thousands of years before Columbus. One by one, those theories have been tested, and one by one, they've collapsed. This is the story of what DNA actually says about the deep history of the Ojibwe people, the Anishinaabe of the Great Lakes. And it turns out the real findings are stranger, older, and more respectful of what Ojibwe oral history has been saying all along than any of the myths that got invented to replace it. Before we get into genetics, it matters to start where the Anishinaabe themselves start. Long before any lab sequenced a single strand of DNA, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi already had a detailed account of where they came from. It's called the Seven Fires Prophecy, and it describes ancestors living along the Atlantic coast in what's now New Brunswick and southeastern Quebec near the Gulf of St. Lawrence, who were told by 7 prophets to migrate west. They were instructed to follow a sacred Migis shell, a cowrie shell, until they reached the land where food grows on water. According to this tradition, the ancestors of the Anishinaabe formed the Council of 3 Fires around the year 796. The migration moved through specific named stopping points, Muniang, which is Montreal, then past Niagara Falls, with the nation eventually splitting into northern and southern branches as it moved. By the 12th or 13th century, they had reached the Great Lakes, and by around 1500, they had settled at Madeline Island on Lake Superior. The Ojibwe historian Anton Troyer has pointed out something easy to miss. The Atlantic coast where this story begins wasn't some marginal, resource-poor edge of the continent. Its natural food resources supported a population density greater than Western Europe at the time. The migration wasn't a retreat, it was a deliberate, prophecy-guided journey through territory that was already valuable, towards something specific, and the destination was confirmed exactly the way the prophecy said it would be, when they found Manumin wild rice growing wild in the waters of the Great Lakes. Food growing on water. That's the story that already existed. Now here's what genetics adds to it, not as a replacement, but as a second, independent line of evidence. The foundational fact, and this applies to every indigenous nation in the Americas, not just the Ojibwe, is this. Every indigenous population on this continent descends from a single founding population that split off from Siberian and East Asian populations, roughly 25,000 years ago. After that split, something unusual happened. That population didn't immediately spread south into the Americas. It sat still, genetically isolated, in Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska and is now underwater, for thousands of years before finally moving south. This is called the Beringian standstill theory. It was first proposed in 1997 and refined in 2007 by a research team that sampled mitochondrial DNA from over 600 Native Americans. What they found were mutation patterns consistent with a long period of isolation in the Bering Land Bridge region. Essentially, a demographic pause that lasted millennia before the actual migration south ever happened. There's physical evidence that lines up with this too. Cut-marked bones found at Bluefish Caves in Yukon Territory may date back roughly 25,000 years. And the first full ancient genome to confirm the whole picture came from a child known as Anzik I, a roughly 12,700-year-old infant from the Clovis culture found in Montana. When scientists sequenced that genome, they found Siberian ancestry and a genetic relationship closer to modern indigenous peoples of Central and South America than to any other population on Earth. That single genome is what put the rival Solutrean hypothesis, the idea that Ice Age Europeans paddled across the Atlantic and seeded the Americas, to rest scientifically. So that's the deep, shared backstory of every native nation on the continent. But here's the part almost nobody covering this topic ever mentions. Actual Ojibwe genetic samples, by name, appear directly in the scientific papers that established how old this ancestry really is. Back in 1997, a study specifically analyzing mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers in Ojibwe communities helped define the founding genetic lineages of the entire population. Later research went further, using a complete Ojibwe mitochondrial genome compared against a Navajo sample to calculate something called a coalescence time, essentially how far back you have to go to find the common ancestor of these lineages. The answer came out to roughly 18,000 years, give or take 6,800 years, implying these lineages arrived in the Americas no later than 11,000 years before the present. In other words, one specific Ojibwe genetic sample helped scientists pin down the minimum age of the entire founding population of the Americas. There's more. A separate study identified a rare mitochondrial subclade called C4C1b in 2 Chippewa individuals and 1 person of likely Dakota ancestry, a marker precise enough to trace one particular ancient lineage branch through time. And the broader pattern of haplogroups found across Ojibwe communities, a 2, B2, C1b, and D1 on the maternal side, with QM3 dominant on the paternal side, matches the wider Algonquian and native North American founding pattern. No separate ancestry, no unusual outside signal, just deep, documented continuity. Now let's talk about the myths. Because for 2 centuries, people kept inventing reasons native peoples couldn't have been who they said they were. And DNA evidence has now closed every single one of those cases. Myth number 1, the X2, a haplogroup. This marker shows up at low frequency in some northeastern native populations, including some Ojibwe communities. And in the early 2000s, it got seized on twice. Once by Solutrean hypothesis supporters, claiming it proved an Ice Age European migration, and separately by Mormon apologists arguing it supported a Middle Eastern migration tied to the Book of Mormon. Neither claim survived scrutiny. No mtDNA ancestral to X2A has ever been found in Europe or the Near East. The New World version of haplogroup X doesn't descend from any Old World branch of it. And here's the detail that really seals it. The oldest, deepest-rooted X2A sample ever found comes from Kennewick Man, on the West Coast. That's the exact opposite of where you'd expect it if it had arrived via an Atlantic crossing. Kennewick Man himself was directly tested for European or Polynesian genetic affinity. That hypothesis was rejected. Myth number 2, the Mound Builder myth. When 19th century Americans encountered the massive earthworks of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, many of them simply couldn't accept that the ancestors of the native peoples living nearby had built them. So they invented a vanished lost white race instead, a story that conveniently also helped justify forcibly removing those same tribes from their land. Some versions even folded in Noah's Ark and the Book of Mormon's Lost Tribes of Israel narrative. The controversy wasn't formally settled until 1894, when the Smithsonian's Cyrus Thomas published a definitive report concluding what should have been obvious from the start. Indigenous people built the mounds. Every piece of archaeology and genetics gathered since has only reinforced that conclusion. Myth number 3, Kennewick Man himself, also known as the Ancient One. An 8,500-year-old skeleton found in Washington state in 1996. Early studies based on skull measurements suggested he wasn't related to Native Americans at all, floating comparisons to Europeans or Polynesians instead. Tribes in the region disputed that finding from day one. They were right to. DNA sequencing published in 2015 found that he belonged to a population closely related to contemporary Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest. In 2016, Congress passed legislation to return his remains, and in 2017, more than 2 decades after the dispute began, he was reburied. Now here's a piece of this history that's specific to the Great Lakes, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Around 6,500 BCE, people in the ancestral homeland of the Anishinaabe were already working metal. Archaeologists call this the Old Copper Complex, a culture that produced copper tools and weapons using nearly pure native copper mined near Lake Superior. To put that in perspective, this metalworking tradition predates Old World Bronze Age metallurgy by thousands of years.
In 2024, a geological study examined lake sediments at Isle Royale and found something that confirmed the scale of this ancient industry. Lead pollution left behind by the heating process used to soften copper for shaping, peaking around 6,000 years ago. That pollution signature matches the archaeological record of large-scale mining activity almost exactly. And there's a wonderfully specific human detail buried in this story too. An ancient old copper complex burial ground in Oconto, Wisconsin, was discovered entirely by accident in 1952, when a 13-year-old boy playing in an old quarry unearthed human bones. For the record, there's also a fringe theory floating around claiming this Lake Superior copper was secretly traded across the Atlantic to Bronze Age Minoans or Phoenicians. It has no archaeological support. It's speculative pseudo-history, in the same family as the Solutrean hypothesis. Interesting to know exists, not something to take seriously. So where does this research stand right now, today? Honestly, there's no single landmark, ancient Ojibwe genome study the way there is for some other nations. Part of the reason is historical, and it's worth understanding why. But the model for what respectful, community-driven genetic research can look like has started appearing elsewhere, and it points toward what could eventually happen with Ojibwe communities specifically. In 2024, a study published in Science Advances came out of a genuine partnership: the Blood, or Kainai, First Nation, the Blackfeet Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and university geneticists working together. They sequenced genomes from both historic ancestors and present-day Blackfoot Confederacy members. What they found was genuinely surprising. Blackfoot genetic lineage split off in the late Pleistocene, before the deep north-south split that defines most other Native American ancestry. And yet, despite Blackfoot being classified in the same Algonquian language family as Ojibwe, the Blood and Blackfoot peoples don't genetically cluster with other Algonquian speakers at all. That's a real lesson worth sitting with. Speaking a related language doesn't necessarily mean sharing recent genetic ancestry. Language family and genetic lineage are not the same map. Separately, in 2025, a nature study conducted with Picuris Pueblo in New Mexico became something of a template for how this kind of research should be done. A project initiated by the tribe itself, explicitly designed to address gaps in oral history on the community's own terms. That last point matters more than it might first seem, because there's a real, documented reason many tribes have been cautious about genetic research at all. In 2003, the Havasupai tribe of Arizona discovered that blood samples they had donated specifically for diabetes research had been used, without their consent, for entirely unrelated studies on schizophrenia, on inbreeding, on migration history. They sued. In 2010, it resulted in a $700,000 settlement. That history is a major part of why caution toward outside geneticists among many tribes, including various Ojibwe bands, isn't paranoia. It's a rational response to something that actually happened. There's one more thing worth understanding clearly, especially if you've ever taken a consumer DNA test yourself and wondered what it means. Genetic ancestry results cannot be used to seek or confirm membership in a tribe or nation. Tribal enrollment is based on documented genealogical kinship, not genetic test results, because tribes hold sovereign, constitutionally protected authority to set their own enrollment criteria. That authority overrides any DNA test, no matter how scientifically rigorous it is. The Citizen Potawatomi Nation, a close Anishinaabe relative of the Ojibwe within the Council of Three Fires, has stated this publicly and directly. A DNA test indicating native ancestry does not by itself make someone eligible for tribal citizenship. They've pointed to the Elizabeth Warren controversy as exactly the kind of misunderstanding this causes. So where does all of this leave us? Strip away 2 centuries of pseudoscience, the lost white race theories, the Solutrean hypothesis, the attempts to find a Middle Eastern or European origin hiding in a single haplogroup. And what's actually left in the genetic record is continuity. Deep, documented, scientifically established continuity between the ancestors who crossed from Siberia roughly 15,000 years ago and the Ojibwe communities living around the Great Lakes today. The oral history said the ancestors came from the Atlantic coast, followed a sacred shell west through named places, and confirmed they'd arrived home when they found food growing on water. The genetic record says those same people descend from a population that paused for thousands of years in an Arctic land bridge before spreading across 2 continents, with the specific lineages already mapped out and named in the scientific literature. These aren't competing stories. They're 2 different kinds of evidence, gathered through 2 completely different methods that happen to converge on the same basic truth. The Ojibwe people have been exactly where they say they've been for exactly as long as they say they've been there. Every theory invented to suggest otherwise has been tested, and every single one of them has failed.